Water is increasingly becoming one of the most scarce global resources, and the City of Johannesburg recently placed a level 2 water restriction in the hope of urging citizens to save water, given the dire drought effects that the city's main water source, the Vaal Dam, is experiencing at the moment. With many parts of Johannesburg having been victim to severe water restrictions and shortages, as well as residents of further afield in parts of the province, Hammanskraal being an example, and they had to deal with sewage in their tap water, it is becoming clearer that there is indeed a water crisis in the province and definitely in the country. Joining us to look at how the city got to this point, we talked to environmental advisor and professor at the Center for Environmental Management, University of the Free State, Professor Anthony Turton, about possible policy and household interventions that may be necessary to help resolve the crisis. Well, it's the immediate effect that we feel, but it's a bigger picture than that. Prof, pleasure to catch up with you once again.
Good to be with you.
I remember the old conversation we had, and you spoke very passionately about this. You spoke about water, energy, and food nexus, as you called it, yes. Right? And you said this was increasingly becoming one of the dangerous problems or challenge facing humanity, not only in South Africa, but the rest of the world, but definitely in our region on the African continent. How is the situation at this time when we think of this food, energy, water nexus, as you called it?
Well, it's a regional issue, so it's with SADC-wide. I'm currently in talks with, in fact, the Namibian presidency over this very same issue, because this El Nino drought that we're feeling in South Africa is being felt even more acutely in Botswana and in Namibia. So the reality is that in the next decade, we are transitioning to a situation within the SADC region where at least 4 of the countries, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana and Namibia, are going to have to make some very difficult policy choices. And it's going to come down to water, energy, food security at national level versus regional level. And it's a very complicated debate, this, but basically we can't be food secure and energy secure and water secure at national level anymore. So we're going to have to start looking beyond our borders and start working on regional strategies. So whether we become regionally food secure, in which case the majority of the food will be produced in the wetter parts of the SADC region, and in particular Angola and northern Mozambique and Zambia. Those are likely to become the food producing areas for the SADC region, which then frees up a lot of water for use in South Africa, because at the moment 62% of our total national water budget goes to agriculture, which is part of our national food security program.
Now, the water shortages that we are experiencing in Joburg and other parts of Gauteng, they are a result of what? Is it because of the drying up of the Vaal Dam? And what about water from Lesotho, for instance? I've been wondering. I mean, there's a big dam there in Lesotho. We're buying water from them. So what happened?
Yes, okay. The purpose of infrastructure is to buffer society from the vagaries of nature. So we happen to live in a drought-prone area where droughts are actually normal. They're not unusual things, they are normal things. So the purpose of water resource management, particularly strategic water resource management, is to put in place sufficient infrastructure to enable society to continue, to enable jobs to be created, economic activities to take place, etc. So what we're actually seeing now is an infrastructural failure. Some people are even referring to it as an infrastructural collapse. And we can unpack that if you want to, because we get our water in Gauteng from a number of sources, but essentially from the Tugela River in KZN, where it gets pumped over the Drakensberg Mountain into the Vaal system, and then that is augmented by substantial flows from Lesotho Highlands, where it comes into the Ash River outfall, also down into Vaal River. So that's essentially where we get our water from. The water footprint of Gauteng, in fact, goes all the way down to the Indian Ocean, all the way down to KZN, along the Tugela River, and it goes all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, all the way down the Vaal Orange River. So in other words, our water footprint in the city of Johannesburg is massive. And to understand it even more, all of the water that goes into the city, that gets pumped uphill at massive cost, massive energy consumption, ends up in the sewers that then gets diverted down into Hartbeespoort Dam, down the Crocodile River, and ends up in Mozambique eventually. So in other words, the city has got a massive footprint, but we must also appreciate that 60% of the total national economy is sustained by the water provided by Rand Water, and 45% of the total population. So what happens in Rand Water area is of national importance.
So we are facing water restrictions and shortages, right? Maybe because of infrastructure failure and so on. What about our consumption behaviors and patterns?
At the moment, when we're sitting here now, we've got a bit of a dry spell. We've got, in fact, a very hot spell at the moment. So what happens when you've got water restrictions or low water availability, and it happens to get hot, there's a natural demand for water. And so the system goes through an unnecessary or an unplanned for peak. With more water coming out of the reservoirs than goes into the reservoirs are unable to fill up.
Right.
So what then happens is they start sucking air into the system, and you now start getting a whole lot of unintended consequences from that. Yeah. People call it water shedding. It's not really a deliberate act of shutting down water supply. In fact, it represents a failure of the infrastructure at that point in time.
So what do you regard this as? Is it just a situation, or is it a crisis?
Well, I've been on the record for some time now talking about this growing water crisis in South Africa. I'm actually getting quite tired of it, to be honest with you, because I've spoken about it so many times that but what more can I say? We've known about this for a long period of time. It is a crisis. It's an absolute crisis. I work at the moment into the commercial world a lot. So if you just take, for example, people that own buildings, either residential estates or commercial estates, high-rise buildings. These are all now at risk, because if you suddenly have a breakdown in your water supply, then there's a lot of unintended consequences. Let's take, for example, a big shopping mall. There was a big shopping mall in the Gauteng area that was shut down this weekend because there was insufficient water to flush toilets. So think of the loss of revenues, think of the jobs from that. But then think of what would happen when you've got a shutdown of water. And now suddenly you get a fire breaking out in a building. So do you have enough water for your fire control, etc.? So in other words, there are many issues. If fire should break out, who's actually responsible? Because you have fire insurance policies, but that is based on certain assumptions about water supply in order to kill the fire. So we're getting to a place where this is the new normal, and the new normal is currently undefined, so we don't know what the new normal is. And unlike energy crisis, when you just go and buy a generator, or you go and buy a gas stove, or gas lights, that's how you overcome that problem. In the case of water, you've got to think about it completely differently. So you're starting to see a lot of things happening now. People that can afford it are now starting to look at putting backup water storage in their own house, in their own building, in the school. Schools are being particularly affected by it. I was at one of the major schools in Gauteng just this week, in fact, and they've got a policy in place now whereby the parents are being asked to send bottled water to school to hydrate the kids in the event of a breakdown. So that is starting to pan out now. So we're actually into a very, almost an uncharted territory, if you like.
Yes, unknown.
The unknown unknowns, and those are the worst because
exactly. Because we don't know how to respond to that kind of situation. And now we're in the city, we can talk about it, and we can complain and maybe compel the authorities to do something about it. I just want to focus a little bit on the outlying areas. I mentioned Hammanskraal as an example, but it's not the only place. Brett's area also has had water shortages for a while. What is the situation out there? What do you think or suggest should be done to alleviate the situation?
Well, the city of Madibeng, or the municipality of Madibeng, which is what you're referring to, is dysfunctional, absolutely dysfunctional. If it was a business, it would be in business rescue. It's one step short of bankruptcy. So it cannot raise money in its own right because it's in a state of insolvency. Now, what's happening out there, some very interesting things, because you get a lot of high-end residential real estate complexes in that area. So I'm working with some of those people now, and they pay their money over to Madibeng, because the water originally comes from Rand Water. They pay the money to Madibeng. Madibeng doesn't pay that money over to Rand Water. Rand Water cuts them off. So So yeah, I would almost say that you've got a classic example in Madibeng of state failure. In that area, the system has failed. The entire administrative system has failed. And because the administrative system has failed, you're now getting failures of your other critical subsystems: water supply, electricity, roads, all those other service delivery issues.
But now, in a case of state failure or systems failure in a municipality like that, you can override the system because water is such a critical resource.
How do you override the system? Because ultimately there's one pipe going in and one pipe coming out, and that's the way it is.
Well, I mean, you replace and place the system under administration, as you suggest, if it were private business, for instance.
Yeah. So that is starting to happen now. Yeah. So you see, we're also getting into some other regulatory constraints now, because I'm working with a lot of people now, say in residential real estate, where they're starting to put backup water on their own property. Down in KZN, for example, where the drought hit first last year, they're starting to mandate now that your body corporates, your cluster homes, sectional title schemes are obliged to keep 48 hours worth of water storage there. Now, there's a lot of regulatory issues there because the regulations haven't caught up with that yet. And when one of the people I'm working with at the moment happens to own a hotel, and they've decided to put storage tanks on top of the hotel roof in order to provide backup. But what they didn't realize, because the plumber did it, and the plumber doesn't understand all of these implications, so we found perfect conditions for the build-up of Legionnaire's disease. So fortunately, we managed to intervene before there was an outbreak of Legionnaire's. So the unknown unknowns we're talking about now. See, it's not just a case of putting a JoJo tank somewhere. It's more than just that.
But now, Prof, tell me, just briefly, we're in Joburg. Water restrictions are in place. Is it a short-term problem, medium to long-term? What is the solution? Briefly.
Okay, all of the information that I have is that we are going to be in a crisis situation until 2025.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, absolutely. Because of the delay in phase 2 of the Lesotho Highlands water scheme, that has pushed everything back. So the system will be constrained at least until 2025. If there's a drought, you'll get these short, sharp shocks, and that will then be a short-term problem area. But until 2025, I'm afraid we are going to be sailing very close to the wind.
Life is going to be different from what we know it to be.
Well, there are many things happening. One of them is that you're starting to get different players coming into the value chain, the water value chain. So you're starting to see the emergence now of public-private partnership type of things, and the private sector in particular is starting to wake up to protect its own interests now. And that's where we get into the regulatory issues, because the regulations haven't yet caught up with that space. So the reality is running ahead of the regulatory and legal environment.
Professor Anthony Turton,
pleasure.
Thank you very much. But it's a big topic, and I'm still keen on that discussion on water, energy, food nexus.
Because, I hope I haven't depressed you too much.
Well, you've made me wake up and smell the coffee if I can get to it. But much appreciated. He is advisor professor at the Center for Environmental Management, University of the Free State, Professor Anthony Turton, one of the foremost experts when it comes to water management in the world.